Let's talk about the Russia element here because it seems like Zelensky has been trying to shout from the rooftops, hey, Vladimir Putin does not negotiate in good faith. And it seems like President Trump could be picking up on that. This is what he said in a Truth Social post. Quote, there was no reason for Putin to be shooting missiles into civilian areas in cities and towns over the last few days. It makes me think that maybe he doesn't want to stop the war. He's just tapping me along. So it seems like President Trump is publicly musing, hey, is Putin taking me for a ride here? What do you think of that?
Well, actually, the meeting that took place between Zelensky and Trump, it also led Trump to publicly threaten additional sanctions on Russia if his counterpart, Vladimir Putin, refused to agree to a ceasefire. So we should note here that Trump has not necessarily been consistent in following through on such threats that he has made in the past, but he appears to be visibly irritated because ultimately he needs to get some sort of a win. Now, what that win looks like on the battlefield is not necessarily going to dictate to President Trump whether or not he's been able to get what he needs to get out of these negotiations, because he needs to show that he has delivered on his promise, if not to end the war, to at least come up with some sort of a solution that results in a durable ceasefire. So not a ceasefire for 2 days, but something that lasts a little bit longer. Now, I'm very skeptical that this can be a long-term ceasefire because, again, we are dealing with Vladimir Putin, who I don't think is going to give up on taking over Ukraine anytime soon. And I think President Trump knows this to a degree, but he may be underestimating how important essentially having full control down the line of Ukraine is important to Vladimir Putin. This is not something that Putin started thinking about last week, and it's probably something that President Trump started thinking about and worrying about relative to Vladimir Putin somewhat recently. So it's a little bit difficult for him to calibrate the importance of Ukraine in this conversation with Russia compared to how he views the importance of this ceasefire and an end to the war.
I want to talk about something you said, something Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, and that is both sides need to want peace, need to want a permanent ceasefire for this to work. Is there evidence, you're saying no time soon, that Putin, that Russia wants a permanent ceasefire? Because he did offer that temporary ceasefire from May 8th to May 11th. Zelensky said that's an attempt at manipulation, but it does take Russia to come to the table in a meaningful way, saying, hey, I want a ceasefire too. Does that look like that's happening?
Well, I do think, Brittany, that actually Vladimir Putin had to give something to President Trump, because obviously patience in Washington has its limits, and President Trump, and not just his broader administration, but him specifically, he was starting to really lose his patience, as you alluded to this earlier in your question. And I do feel that it was very important for Vladimir Putin to at least hand something over to his U.S. counterpart. Now, is this a solution? I don't think so. I think it's a bit of a stretch to even call it a band-aid, because we have seen, sadly, that Russia does not necessarily abide by its own unilateral temporary halts to fighting in terms of any commitments to that. That it ends up breaking very quickly whenever it decides to do so. So in a way, the Victory Day related temporary halt in fighting that President Putin announced for the May Day, and broadly for the May Victory Day observations, I think this signals that Moscow does not anticipate a lasting ceasefire agreement anytime soon, because if they were to think that a longer term ceasefire is around the corner, I don't think that 2-3 days would really be worth even discussing at this point, because they would be working towards something more durable. So I am skeptical about this announcement. I am generally skeptical about these unilateral sort of moves and commitments to stop fighting for a couple of days, because what does that actually do? Perhaps it signals that there is some willingness to stop, but then there would really have to be a total halt in fighting. And in the prior examples, including over Easter, we have not seen that. So, especially through the prism of a truce, if anything, both Russian and Ukrainian positions on the broader war and any prospect of a peace settlement as such continue to be unchanged. So at the core, we still have the same problem. There's massive distrust between the two sides. And as we've discussed over the past several months when we revisit this topic, anything that is really going to signal a political settlement, a peace settlement, is going to be unlikely, not just in the coming weeks, but I would argue that we really are at least months away from even seeing realistically, can there be any sort of a durable solution here? And I'm just not sure that Vladimir Putin feels any real pressure, especially bearing in mind that Russia does continue to stand pretty strong on the battlefield, for them to feel like they really need to stop fighting because they have to regroup and rearm. There's just no need for them to do that.